Yep, it looks like we're live. All right. Um, I'm here to host. I'm here to moderate for you today. My name's Soup or Josh. Either one. I am a non-binary game designer from California. I make games. I freelance write. I do all of those things. I wear many hats. I have a podcast. But why don't you two introduce yourselves? Start with Dominique.
Yeah, sure. Hi, I'm Dominique. I am a writer, editor, and consultant and game designer working in the RPG space, as well as a bit in like board games, LARPs, and video games. Um, I consider myself like an all-around RPG hooligan, which is another way of saying that I just wear too many hats.
Yep.
Yeah,
That
right.
sounds about right.
Yeah, and freelancing as well as working on my own projects in the space.
All right.
Cool. Hey, I'm Jen Kretschmer. I am a writer, producer, actor, streamer. I'm one of the authors on Candlekeep Mysteries, which is the latest D&D hardcover. And I love talking about games, and I've been playing tabletop games for about 20 years now. And yeah, I'm happy to be here and talk about safety tools. They're super important.
Very cool, very cool. Yeah, so I guess like to start, like we should talk about what safety tools and consent are. Obviously, when you play a tabletop role-playing game or really any kind of game, the most important thing is you want to make sure that everybody at the table is feeling safe and like they're included. You want to make sure there's no like triggering content. That's pretty obvious, but like like how do you do that, right? And I kind of wanted to start by talking about safety tools because there are quite a variety of them out there. Do you have any particular favorites that you want to talk about in particular?
Yeah,
Oh,
oh,
go
go
ahead.
ahead.
No, no, you go ahead.
Oh, I was gonna say I think that the tabletop RPG safety toolkit
Yeah,
that Kiana and Lauren made is extraordinary. I can't recommend that highly enough. And that does encompass a number of different tools and explores a bunch of different tools. Because I think different tools have different places in gaming. I think it depends on the situation, what group you're with, whether it's a long-term game or kind of a pickup game, what your audience is. For that, and by audience, I mean your players at the table and yourself. But also, if you are playing a streamed game, that comes into play as well because
right.
you want the audience to feel comfortable. So I think everything from I use on regularly everything from X card and variations on an X card system to the Luxton technique, which actually is my favorite of the techniques, but it's fairly involved, so it does require a group which you can really establish that and is comfortable having things in place should someone decide they want to veer into a traumatic situation by choice.
Right. Hmm.
Um, so those are things I think that are really important.
Sure. Cool.
Yeah.
Yeah. Go on.
I feel like I do have a favorite, but I think that it depends on the situation, and I also try to make sure that every table that I'm playing at has what I would consider like proactive safety tools, which have to do more with like advanced consent, and also like
Mhm.
reactive safety tools that have to do with if something comes up in the moment. So an example is like lines and veils, where you're saying what content you don't want to touch on at the table versus what content is okay if you tread carefully or move slowly, and making those lists ahead of time. That's a more proactive safety tool, and then you have the reactive safety tool like an X card, where that gives you the ability to indicate like someone said or did something that is not okay and how do we move on from that. And the other thing that I think is really important when you're scoping out safety tools before a session or a campaign is to think about if someone uses your reactive safety tool, if someone invokes the X card or calls for a pause or a rewind if you're using the like, script change tool, which is one of my favorites.
Hmm.
um, then what do you do? I think there should
Right.
be like protocol in place for that um, before you're in an emotionally heightened situation, so that when people might be reacting from a place of like being triggered or being uncomfortable or upset or not thinking the most clearly, you already sort of have that reaction scripted, and it's not like, oh, something terribly wrong has happened and now we all have to deal with the social consequences of that, as well as trying to keep this game like on the rails. Um, so I think like have proactive safety tools, have reactive safety tools, and then also talk about what you do when someone invokes a safety tool in play are like the three most important things going into establishing safety tools in games. And just to go back to the topic of favorites, I think my favorite for like reactive tools is the script change tool by Bo Sheldon, but it always depends on the type of game and who you're playing with. And I think like if anyone has their own favorite, something that they are more comfortable with, then I'm always amenable to using that.
Yeah, and I think it's
Totally.
really important to ensure that your reactive tools are operate in multiple modalities, that they can be verbal, they can be pointing to a card, that because you just don't know what someone's sensory input is going to be. A lot of my work is in disability, and mental health is part of that. It's a subset of disability, and so when you're dealing with you can deal with sensory overload or aphasia, or any heightened stress response can affect your ability to communicate in one way or another. So having a visual cue, an audio cue, whatever a person can do in that moment, should there need to be a use for a tool at the table. But I think also what you were saying, Dominique, leads us to the idea of a session zero and the importance of a session zero.
Yeah.
Because if you're not having one for any sort of non-convention pickup game,
Right.
non-one-shot situation, you are setting yourself up for trouble. It's
Yeah,
really
yeah.
important to have those conversations right off the bat about what is this game? Where are everyone's boundaries? How can you communicate things that you may not feel comfortable communicating at the table? How do we resolve conflicts, whether between players or between player and DM? What's our protocol? Because that allows you to then have this codified agreement of how that process works. It needs to maintain some flexibility, but that process should be established off the bat.
Yeah.
Yeah, for especially like an extended game of any sort, a session zero is probably like the number one thing to me. Like I think a session zero, as long as you're not in like a pickup game, is probably like the singular most like important thing to have, because then you can establish like what other tools you want to use and like what other protocol you want to have for situations. And I think, Dominique, you're right that it's very important that you have a protocol for how to react when somebody invokes the safety tool, because it's one thing to have safety tools in play and say like this we're going to use this system and I think it's really nice because it's robust in these ways, but if the culture at your table is one where you're not sure what to do after someone invokes it, then you can still run into a lot of trouble that you're not expecting, even though you're like, but I have the right tool, right? It's
Right.
very much about having the right tool, but also having the right table for it and the right culture for it at your table.
And I always try to create an environment where the way that contingencies are set up, or the way that like post invoking safety tool protocol is set up, is such that the person who invoked the safety tool, the person whose like limit might have been stepped on or is reacting in that way, like never, whether like explicitly or implicitly at all, feels punished for speaking out about that thing. And
Yes.
if anything, is like praised or thanked for bringing that to the attention of the larger group,
Right.
for keeping themselves safe and for also keeping everyone else safe. And I also think a very underrated session zero question is, if this game were like a movie or a TV show, what
Mhm.
would you want the rating to be?
Yeah. Right.
Yeah, Shanna, the Monty Cook consent in gaming checklist is a really great place to go as well, and there are a number of different virtual versions of it that you can set up. I also like to have a Google document, so that a Google survey that I can set to anonymous, so that I can have ongoing feedback from players, and they have a safe way to anonymously inform me of information that they want me to know. Some people are not comfortable sharing publicly that what their phobias are or where their lines are, So that gives me the information. I can compile it and I can share it with the group and say, hey, these are the lines and veils, these are the boundaries, these are the no-go zones. And yeah, knowing the tone going in is, hang on, sorry, I have sirens outside.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
the Monty Cook Games Consent in Gaming, that free resource is I highly recommend it, especially because it includes the checklist of like where you can like a list of things that could be potentially off-putting or triggering to people, and you get to just
Right.
go through and say like what is okay and what is not okay with you, or what is
Yeah.
okay if like handled carefully. And it's not like a comprehensive list because no list really can be. But it gives you a place to start if you're not sure like what content might come up at your table.
Yeah.
I'm putting
Yeah.
it into the Discord. I'm putting a digital version of it. That is, you can fill out, it's a form fillable, and then you can PDF it and then send it.
Mhm.
Yeah, it's really important. And thinking about, oh, there's another one. Awesome. Um, One of the really important things to think about too when you're thinking about session zero and lines and veils is being aware that you don't know what you don't know.
Mhm.
And so if someone flags something, I mean, respect at the table. This is a game, it's supposed to be fun. And if it's not fun, something is wrong. Um, and so recognizing that there are things of which you are going to be ignorant that may be affecting your players and opening up clear lines of communication so those things can be communicated to you. And if something is communicated to you, your job, if you are a GM, is to respect that and abide by kind of the social contract of a table.
Yeah, I mean, I liked what you were saying, Jen, about the Google form. I think that's a really great way of doing it, especially because, when we play, tabletop games, a lot of the times we get very involved and, kind of we can feel very emotionally attached to things. And it can be very difficult to bring those things up, as with any kind of conversation or relationship, right? It is very difficult to say things. It's very anxiety inducing. So to have an anonymous vector for that, I think is actually really great. I've never heard that before.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and I think too, I use an ongoing one during campaigns. Like I also think of it kind of in an exponential way. Like I'll check in much more frequently towards the beginning of a campaign with people,
Right.
and then I'll slow it down and maybe check in once every couple of months to make sure. But it's the same survey, just asking kind of the same questions. What have you liked? What haven't you liked? Who's your favorite NPC? What's your favorite encounter? Are there things you'd like to change? And just having that, first of all, makes me a better GM because I'm adapting the game to the group and improving my own skill, but also is giving everyone a means of feedback. And I will say that Demiplane has integrated both safety tools and a feedback system into their platform. So after every game, you're prompted to fill things out if you play on Demiplane. So
That's
um,
really
yeah, it's pretty
Cool.
great.
Yeah.
something that's like similar that
Mhm.
I try to do as a GM is just set aside time at the end of a session for like stars and wishes or roses and thorns or whatever, just a way
Mhm.
to accumulate feedback, which sort of gets into feedback that helps me feel like I'm growing as a GM because it can be things like, what was your favorite encounter? Like, what would you like to see more of in this role play? But it can also get into things that have to do more with consent and safety, like I would like to see more romantic interaction with this NPC, but as long as it does not involve these themes, right?
Right.
Which like it gives your players just more opportunity to communicate openly with you about what they're liking, what they're liking less.
Yeah, 100%.
Yeah, I mean, RPG tools, safety and consent tools have come a long way, especially in recent years. It was the culture was quite different, right? About like a decade or so ago. And we have a plethora of tools now, and we don't just have to kind of like hope that people aren't being shitty. But I do want to talk about how, largely speaking, a lot of these safety tools were originally conceived as kind of safeguards for convention games. So it's important to consider safety outside of the tools, right?
I mean,
I think that's
before that,
actually
they were conceived as consent tools,
right. Yeah,
as in
exactly.
adult
From
consent,
like
and
adult consent. Yeah.
yeah, it came out of kink
Mhm.
communities,
Yeah.
interestingly enough. So I think that's actually a really one of the things I think that's really important when you talk about that is the idea of aftercare.
Mhm.
And so
Yeah.
that after any sort of situation, I think the stars and wishes is a really good way to think about that. But also in terms of when they get used, you always have time afterward to say, okay, let's figure out how
Mhm.
we, first of all, how we make sure everybody's okay now, and second of all, how we, um, avoid issues in the future and make sure we're all leaving feeling okay.
Right. I think some decompression time at the end of a session, especially an intensive one, is very important. Even if it's, something just as simple as like, oh, we're not playing like the game anymore. We're not in that space, but I would still like to like be social in kind of a lower stake environment, like let's just hang out or like
Mhm.
play games or something, right? Like a video game, something that doesn't require kind of me to put more of myself into. Um, but yeah, I kind of wanted to talk about games that build safety into the structure of the game itself. One very prominent example I can think of right now is J Dragon's Wander Home, which is kind of the big like topic of the RPG space at the moment. Um, and how J integrates like safety and consent into the structure and rules of the game itself, so that you don't have to rely as hard on external tools. Because I think some people and like this isn't obviously a blanket statement, but some people can chafe against safety tools just because it will take them out of the moment, right? And everybody is in charge of their own experience, and it's important that like you don't play in a way that is unsafe for people. But I think it's really cool that now we're getting games where that is one of the foremost concerns in the design process.
Mhm. 100%.
Um,
And I also think it's a big deal that D&D started talking about safety and consent in the official products, because that's a big step
Yeah.
from what it was
yeah,
prior to that
Dominique, I kind of wanted to hear
too.
your perspective on this as a designer.
hmm I try to, I feel like I'm of two minds about this. So with my game Trial, which is pretty thematically heavy because it's about race in the criminal justice system, I worked really hard to build safety tools in to
Mhm.
the design, and to just write with an ethos of like prioritizing consent and making sure that the relationship between the players and the GM is never an adversarial one, even if there's
Right.
like tension between NPCs and characters. Um, and then with my most recent project, Tomorrow Revelation 3, which is about living in a capitalist hellscape in space, we
Awesome.
it's pretty heavy because it deals with a lot of things that have touchstones in reality. So my co-writer and I, our sort of guiding framework with writing the game was asking, so in this given situation, what is the worst thing that is actually happening somewhere in the world that we can
Hmm.
rip and put in this game? Um, so we get into things like labor abuse issues or like child labor or like food scarcity. And with that, because the breadth of themes that could come up are so open-ended and open to the players, it seemed more prudent to say, like, here are some tools that we recommend. However, if you have ones that work better for you, use them. And I think that the difference there is that because Trial is about a specific scenario with specific player characters and specific NPCs, it was relatively easier for me to say, here are safety tools that work well with this concept and this content. Whereas with Revelation 3, because there are so many open-ended adventures that parties can play, um, it seemed like the better move was to say, like, we're writing this with consent in mind. We're writing this assuming that, you're all friends and you're all, or at least like all going to approach each other with like some basic level of decency. We're not writing this for people who are going to show up and try to trigger each other. Um, and being explicit about that in the text, but also saying like, um, what the tools that you may use might need to come out of the content that you're playing with. And there are so many different
Right.
social and political issues on this space station that the game is set on that you can choose to tackle, that maybe you choose safety tools based on where you see your campaign going.
Definitely, definitely. Um, I did want to kind of transition there into to talking about cultural safety, because obviously it is as we mentioned before, one thing to have safety tools and another thing entirely to be able to use them. And we've certainly talked about it to a certain extent. The idea that you want to have a structural safety net in your group itself, especially if you're playing as friends, right? You upsetting each other, especially on purpose, right? Um, but yeah, is there anything else that that you specifically do when you run or play in sessions? Like, what can you do as a GM, and what can you do as a player to make the table a safer place?
I mean, I think a lot of it is just being a decent human and doing your homework about the
Yeah,
actual world and the experiences that people are dealing with on a day-to-day basis, and historical context for those things. um doing your homework before you sit down at a table. And also, I think part of it is acknowledging the historical precedent that has been set in some games. I think you can't approach Eurocentric wargaming without going, well, this was a game that was written by, cishet white guys. Um, and that has consequences for what's established in the world. So I think, you know, really so much of it is just being a decent human being, and actively, working to expand your knowledge and being anti-racist and anti-ableist, and ensuring that your table is safe for marginalized people. And if you get corrected on something, going, whoops,
hmm,
okay, I'm sorry, I will adjust and not do this again. um I have homework to do. um you know that that I think is the basis of so much of that.
yeah,
Yeah,
yeah, for
and
sure.
to what Jen said, just being aware of your own biases, but also being aware of biases that are sort of inherent in the text of the games that you're playing, knowing who wrote the game and who they wrote it for. And if the
Right,
people that you're playing with are not that audience, you might have to make some adaptations to make it more welcoming to that audience. Um, they're like games where you can sort of read it and say like, oh, this was written with a specific audience in mind, and I'm not that person. But if I still want to find my way into this universe, well, what adaptations or tools do I have in mind to make this feel like a safe and rewarding and like validating experience for me and for people who look like me or think like me or have genders like mine or whatever, you know? Um, and I think that there's a measure of being proactive about that with your party and your table, especially with people that you know, and you know what identities they have that might be unlike or unaligned with the identities of the creators or the identities that go into
right.
making the work. Think just thinking like, oh, I'm playing with someone who might feel alienated by this. What can I do to preemptively make them feel more included by this content than they are, forced out by it?
Yeah, no, I love that. I really liked what you said about like adapting a game for your table, because it is important to choose the right game for your table. Not everybody wants to play a game that is like D&D, right? But a lot of people do, and sometimes those people will want to play this game that obviously it has problems, is problematic, but um at the end of the day, right, you're just kind of gathering for a fun time, and you want to make sure that everybody at the table has a good time. So even if you choose a game that has kind of these inherent biases, being able to see them and adjust for them, I think is very important. That's one thing I do whenever I play like something like D&D, where I make it very clear and I'm glad that and like, obviously baby steps, right? But I'm glad that like Wizards is kind of taking a step back and being like, well, I mean, racial bonus is kind of fucked up, isn't it? Right? Isn't that kind of messed up, right? So for the past couple of years that I've been playing with like my like high school group or whatever, right? We've completely just like thrown out the idea of like race and racial bonus being tied in any way whatsoever, right? And that's just like a very simple thing you can do, right? Because it means that you can kind of please the people who are like, oh, I want to like make like cool builds and like whatever, right? But at the same time, it's not just like, well, you see, dwarves are inherently different from elves in these ways biologically, which gets into some very uncomfortable territory, obviously.
Yeah. Also, like
100%.
like RPGs, no matter how old they are or revered by their communities they are not the Bible, and the big
Yeah,
RPG man in the sky is not going to smite you for changing the rules to make it more welcoming to your community.
Hmm. This
that's
is
very
true.
true. Yep. Um, it is an important topic, right? Where even kind of especially in certain like I would say demographics of like the RPG community, like that kind of stuff is it's very like gay kept. It's like, oh, you use safety tools? How dare you, right? And it's like it's such a disappointing attitude to have. And it kind of ties into the idea of like, well, you're not playing it the right way, which like the right way is like kind of terrible and awful. But like, yeah, for sure. Um,
But I was talking to somebody recently, and we were talking about like playing something exactly by the rules. And you
hmm,
look at something like D&D, and I don't know anyone who's played it exactly by the rules because it's so there are so many of them that it's not sustainable. Like it's and some contradicting. Like it's just it's always been pick and choose in that way. And yet people think that you're just destroying things when you're saying, well,
right.
but you
And
can you can shift things.
and oh, I was just gonna say, someone in chat mentioned that you're inevitably going to run into like triggering content as someone who plays RPGs. Like no matter how hard you prepare, it will come up. And that's why like RPG like safety tools and session zeros and lines and veils and all those kinds of things that are important, right? But like at the end of the day, the most important thing is to be able to be a person who, like you said, Jen, like be just a good person, right? But like to be a decent person, one of the most important things, at least in my opinion, is to be able to listen to other people and like take yourself out of it, right? So if somebody says, hey, like what you did harmed me in some way, it's not an attack on you. That's just saying like something like that you should just avoid in the future because it's not, creating a safe environment for everyone at the table. Yeah, yeah.
I also think there's a
Uh,
difference between, to speak to the comment in the Discord about how safety can't be fully guaranteed, there's a difference between approaching something as saying, like, oh, I'm going to try to guarantee everyone's safety, and if someone gets triggered or someone gets upset at all, then we failed, versus like trying to
yeah.
reduce harm.
Mhm.
And I feel like approaching with a more like harm reduction mindset, it
Yeah.
changes the parameters of success and
Mhm.
probably makes
Yeah.
everyone feel better about their odds of succeeding at whatever the task at hand is. And I also think
Yeah.
like humans are like even the most socially adept human is still somewhat socially clumsy. Like people hurt each other. It happens. It happens on purpose with an accident. And I think that my goal with safety tools is to make sure that no one's hurting anyone on purpose, which I try not to play with people who would do that. And that if
Right.
someone gets hurt on accident, which they will, we have the tools as a group to bounce back from it as seamlessly as we possibly can.
Mhm.
Yeah. I 100% agree. I like it's kind of a personal philosophy of mine, right? To be somebody who lives to reduce harm, not to cause no harm. It's one of those like there's no ethical consumption under capitalism things, right? It's just like
Yeah.
you're never going to be perfect, and you should never like it's not that you shouldn't strive to be perfect necessarily, but I think it's like more attainable and more realistic that you should just strive to, you know, be as less shitty as possible, right? It's kind of like it's this problem where people assume because they are like one of the good ones or whatever, right? Like, oh, I'm like somebody who's like safe. That's what I think of myself as, right? If you tie your identity to that, then it becomes a lot harder to disentangle. So you know, being able to take yourself out of that, and I know it's very difficult, right? It's easier said than done. Is very important. I did want to I I'm very sorry, like, because we don't have a lot of time. But I did want to open the floor to questions, so that we could, answer a couple questions and then plug our stuff, and then we'll be on our way.
While people are putting questions in, I'm going to throw a resource guide that I created. It's also in my pinned tweet on Twitter. It's an accessibility in gaming resource guide. So it deals with narratives and language around disability, writing, characters, tropes, things like that. And it also has a bunch of like streaming resources and in-person guides, just because it's something that isn't discussed a lot. And it can be tricky to find those things if you aren't, in the community. So, and safety tools. I have a bunch of safety tool links in there as well. So,
Sure, yeah. Okay, well, let's take this question that was put in at near the beginning of the panel. Brandon asks, what methods do you recommend for situations where players who are experiencing harm during the session may feel hesitant to or refuse to use reactive safety tools like the X card, for instance, due to not wanting to seem confrontational with the play group? I do think that we somewhat answered this in the course of the panel, but having multiple avenues, multiple different methods of reaching out and like using those safety tools, even if it's like an end of session like survey or that kind of stuff, something anonymous is nice. Being considerate of like communication styles, right? Like verbal, nonverbal, those kinds of things. Yeah.
I also think if I'm giving someone like a bajillion ways to signal a problem and they're having a problem and not signaling the problem, then it gets to a point where
Mhm.
that's on them. And
Yeah.
I mean, I feel like if you have like verbal and nonverbal and anonymous and public ways to signal an issue, and all of those tools are open to you, and you have an issue and you don't want anyone to know, then I would want to drill down into the reason why that person like does not feel safe to bring up this concern.
Right. Yeah.
And maybe it's a matter of them not feeling safe with the group at large, in which case maybe, maybe it's not the right fit in a broader sense. Not
Yeah.
to like I don't want to sound like that's like punitive or reactionary, but I think that if like I were GMing and I were playing with someone who I could not trust to take steps to look out for their own safety, then I don't think I would feel comfortable playing with that person long term.
Yeah.
yeah, there's a degree of personal responsibility that you have to take if you're going to sit down at a table to play, in terms of advocating for yourself in that play space. And I agree that if we've established that there are these safety tools, I am going to assume that as long as we are within the boundaries of all of our session zero conversations and everything, and I'm abiding by my side of the agreement, that I am still in bounds with what we're doing. And if for some reason that's not in bounds and no one's telling me, then there's a social contract there that is not being upheld by the other people, which is a bigger problem in terms of table safety as a whole.
Yeah. For sure. I love that, right? It is very important, right, that people do understand that at the end of the day, right, there are certain situations where certain people will not be able to guarantee their own safety, and I like that kind of framing of it too, because it's not just like, well, they should just like suck it up or whatever, right? It's like, I don't feel safe playing with you if you're not going to be comfortable while we're playing, right? It's for all of us at the table to feel like we are, because otherwise it feels kind of like it can make the group feel like you have to walk on eggshells because you don't know, right? And you can never know what those things could be, right? Like not even like I would say, like, right, I wouldn't even know every possible thing that could upset me, but if something comes up, I'll be like, oh, that's like upsetting to me, right?
Yeah.
And I think you're right, Dominique, that it largely comes down to kind of broader play structure, right? About like group dynamics and stuff. Like if you find someone doesn't really feel comfortable speaking up in the group, then that group may just not be the right fit, and that's completely okay, right? It's like you mentioned earlier, Jen, that the consent and safety tools largely come from like adult kink communities, and that is important to consider, right? Because adult kink communities are one of the, I would say, like most important vanguards of like sex and safety and consent, and like much more forward thinking about how relationships operate than outside of that sphere, right? That's where it all kind of comes from, right? And even though we're not out here like doing adult kink stuff necessarily, right? It is important to consider that as a conversation, as a relationship, it is important that you understand what that is, right? And you set your own boundaries.
I also think that there's an element of like what you frame as a success versus like what you frame as a failure. I think that
Right.
someone having an issue activating safety tools and not being because of that not being the right fit for a group, but discovering that and honoring that and proceeding moving forward,
Right.
in like a respectful way, that's still a success because you've done something that's going to make everyone in that group feel better about their experience.
Right.
I think that saying like, oh, this person isn't the right fit because of the way that they use safety tools or because of the way that they approach triggering content, like that doesn't mean that anyone's failed. It means that you might not mesh the right way, but
Mhm.
it doesn't, like, no one is in trouble.
I mean, I'd even
Yeah.
argue that
Yeah.
using safety tools, having safety tools activated is a success because
Mhm.
it means your fail safes are working, your
Yeah. Yeah.
parachute
Yeah.
works. And you hope you never have to use it, but if you're going to have to use it, the fact that it works is a great thing. Like that's a big
Yeah.
ol'
Yeah. Yeah.
success there. And so, and I saw another question about have you ever been at a table where someone used safety tools? Absolutely. And when I'm DMing, often with a new group, I'll intentionally use a safety tool myself very early on to show,
Mhm.
hey, this is acceptable. I'm going to set myself up for a situation and I'm going to say, hey, you know what? I'm going to use this tool right now because I think I'm veering into something and I'm going to steer us away from that. So,
Yeah.
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 And it just, it's by example. I'm saying, hey, this is a safe place for this and it's cool. And I did it first. So don't be afraid to use it too. Which can be a way to
Yeah.
kind
Yeah.
of
Yeah.
ease anxieties about them being, oh no, but what if it becomes a huge thing? And you just show how not big a deal it is to
Right.
activate it, unless it needs to be
Yeah.
like,
Yeah.
hey, we're gonna stop.
Yeah, I like that a lot. I do think that there is a certain like amount of pressure to being like the first one to use a safety tool, right? So if you kind of get that out of the way, yeah, 100%, and it's a little easier after that. Especially, like some people, even if you explain like how a tool is used, they might not like think about it in the moment, right? You want to make sure that it's something that people can think of when upsetting content comes up. Yeah, well, we have just about 10-ish minutes left. And it looks like no one else has any questions. So why don't we, gear towards wrapping up so that we can clear the room before the next, panel and stuff have to go. Um, I would really like for you to plug your things and your socials and anything else. Does not have to be related to tabletop gaming whatsoever. Dominique, I'd like to start with you.
Yeah, sure. I'm Dominique Dickey. You can find me on Twitter at DomSDickey or at DominiqueDickey.com. My game Trial about race in the criminal justice system can be found at domsdickey.itch.io. And I think that Brandon put the link in the Discord. Shout out to Brandon for doing that. And Tomorrow in Revelation 3, capitalist hellscape game about surviving and building community on a hypercapitalist space station several hundred years in the future. Recently wrapped on Kickstarter. We had a super successful campaign and will be on BackerKit accepting late pledges soon. And I will definitely be hearing about that on Twitter when it happens. So I think Twitter is the best way to stay up to date on if you want to get in late on that.
Sure. Great. Jen?
Yeah, I'm Jen Kretschmer. You can find me on Twitter as at DreamWisp. You can find me on Twitch streaming as DreamWisp Jen. I am on Heroes of the Plains, which is on Tuesdays at 6 p.m. Pacific on Demiplane RPG on Twitch. That's a continuation of a show we've been doing for 3 years, which has gone through a couple different iterations. And I am one of the authors of Candlekeep Mysteries. I wrote the accessibility and gaming
Oh,
resource
nice,
guide.
nice.
And yeah, I wrote the first wheelchair accessible adventure for D&D. So that was my Candlekeep contribution.
Very,
Um,
very cool.
and I'm really happy to chat with everybody. This
Yeah,
is
I'm
great.
really glad I got to chat with you too. I've never met you before in my life, but this
Yeah.
this conversation was very enjoyable.
Yeah, it was
Um,
fantastic.
so I am Soup. You can find me all the places at Literal Soup or literalsoup.itch.io, where you can find my games. Two of them, three of them. First Contact, which is a game about high school aged romance, but the twist is one of you is an alien. You can find Crossing the Seven Stars, which is a game about lesbians that pine over each other over multiple lifetimes. Very cool. And you can find my game Firewaltz Love is Coming Again, which is a hot-blooded mech rivalry game in the Ultimate Micro RPG Collection, published by Simon and Schuster. That game is definitely the hardest to get a hold of because you can't get a digital copy, but it is also the one I am probably the most proud of. And if anyone ever wants a mech name generated, just hit me up on Twitter at Literal Soup. Yeah, I'm also a freelance writer, so I do freelancing work for Evil Hat and Paizo and stuff. I have the Pathfinder Bestiary. You can find some of my work in this. It's very cool. I just got this today. It's actually it's a very hefty book. It's very cool. I love getting to see my work published in like a big glossy hardcover. There's something nice about
Yeah.
it.
It's a
It's a good
special.
feeling.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Out of reach, but I got my copy of Thirsty Sword Lesbians earlier this week, and I wrote
Yeah.
a setting in that, and it was very exciting to see it in print.
Yeah.
Not
I
sure
wrote
if it's like too far.
which sighting did you write for that one?
Lesbians Coffee House.
Nice. Oh, good, good, good. I
Yeah.
wrote To Light a Fire in My Soul, which is the mech one. So
Sick.
That's so cool.
very cool, very cool. I remember hearing about Thirsty Sword Lesbians years ago when I first met April, and I'm very glad I got to work on the project. It's very cool. Yeah. So it looks like our Twitters are getting plugged in the Discord, and I'm glad I got to have a chat with you all. And I'm glad for everybody in the chat as well. Thank you for being so constructive and wonderful. And I think we'll close out the panel there. So bye everyone.